This episode contains the discussion of the experiences of prisoners at the hands of the Japanese during the Second World War, including the Sandakan Death March, which may be distressing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Australia's military history told through the stories of those who served. This is I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military podcast. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and this is episode 71, recorded on the 27th of October 2024. Gunner Albert Niel Cleary, the Sandakan Death March. Let's get started. There's just one quick announcement I want to make before I get started, and that is I want to wish Armoured Emu Brigade member Grace congratulations on her recent wedding, and wish her all the best on this next step in her life. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Albert Niel Cleary was born on the 16th of June 1922 in East Geelong, Victoria, the eldest of 5 children to James Ross Cleary and Iris Tech Cleary nee Munyard. Known by his middle name Neale, his sister Nancy vividly remembered him building a canoe just prior to joining the Citizens Military Force on the 11th of June 1940 as part of the 23rd Battalion for Home Defence, and routinely playing popular songs on a mandolin for hours in their Geelong home. On the 20th of September 1940, he would be assigned to the 2nd Field Training Regiment in Puckapunyal, the main army training camp in Victoria. Now, he would spend less than a year in the militia before he was discharged due to, quote, services being no longer required on enlistment to the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, unquote, on the 22nd of April 1941. But even in that brief time, Cleary had made himself known to the local provo. Cleary would go absent without leave on New Year's Eve 1940, of which he was awarded 7 days confinement to barracks, after which he was assigned to the administrative headquarters at Puckapunyal. There, he was fined in February for being, quote, beyond limits fixed by regimental orders, unquote, and was fined 10 shillings. He would once again go AWL for a week in April just prior to volunteering for the AIF, and was in detention for another 5 days. He'd be taken on strength with the reserve recruit depot on the 30th of April, and 5 days later he'd be granted 5 days leave without pay prior to his assignment to the 2nd Field Training Regiment for posting to the 9th Reinforcements to the 2nd Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery. When Cleary joined the militia, he gave his birth year as 1919. However, when enlisting in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, he gave it as 1920. Now, as I mentioned previously, during the World Wars, the quote-unquote age of majority, or when someone was legally considered an adult, was 21 years, which meant that anyone younger than that wanting to volunteer for overseas service had to get parental consent. Now, the reason why Cleary changed his birth year has been lost to history, but most likely it was because he didn't have to provide that consent. On the 21st of June 1941, he would go AWOL once again, this time for 3 days, and when he returned, he would receive 7 days confinement to barracks and forfeiture of 3 days' pay. The following month, he would be assigned to reinforcements, the 2nd 4th Anti-Tank Regiment, and would embark for overseas service in early August. However, as the convoy was transiting from the east coast to the west, he would be admonished for quote-unquote conduct in the prejudice of good order and military discipline, and fined £5 for insubordinate language. When the transport put into Port Fremantle in Western Australia, he would abscond from the ship and go AWL for 5 days, before presenting to the commanding officer of the Western Command's Guard Depot, where he was informed that he had forfeited 4 days' pay, was fined £20 for a total forfeiture of £160, and sentenced to 28 days detention, which he served in Western Australia. At the end of his sentence, he was marched out to meet the next convoy bound for the 8th Australian Division, currently based in Singapore, in late September, as part of Malaya Command. He would arrive there on the 5th of October 1941 and was marched in the General Base Depot at Johor Bahru. Now, before you think this is actually mistitled From Duty to Dishonour episode, I haven't finished the story yet. Gunner Cleary would remain at the base depot well after Japan's entrance into the Second World War, when on the 7th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese forces launched simultaneous attacks on Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. Now, due to the international dateline, the Japanese attack on Malaya occurred 10 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and on the 17th of January 1942, he'd be transferred to the 2nd 15th Field Regiment. In previous episodes, I have mentioned that due to the state of the war in Europe, that Britain had stripped its overseas territories in the Pacific to reinforce positions in North Africa and England, and left the defence of these colonial holdings to the Dominions. The core of this was Singapore. After the First World War, Australia and New Zealand re-evaluated their strategic position in the world and decided that Japan was its greatest threat, something warned at by senior officers in the Australian military forces as early as 1905, following the Russo-Japanese War, but was only realised following the territorial carve-up of German Pacific positions following the armistice, with Japan controlling all German territory north of the equator, and Britain and her dominions mandated everything south of it. As a result, Britain controlled large swaths of the Southwest Pacific, and in response, in 1919, Singapore, which is located within the Strait of Malacca between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, a strategically important sea route even to this day, was chosen as the site of a 54 square kilometre British naval base. one that was paid for in part by the governments of Australia and New Zealand, who saw it as a way to fight a Pacific War as far away from the home shores as they could. The core intent behind the various war plans, collectively known as the Singapore Strategy, was to either defeat Japan. The core intent behind the various war plans that are collectively known as the Singapore Strategy was either to defeat Japan or to simply dissuade Japanese aggression in the South Pacific. Most of these involved a large British surface fleet supported by air power. Unfortunately, these plans were never truly updated or acted upon as the political situation changed in England, namely the gutting of the Royal Navy due to the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty and the 1930 London Naval Conference, which established naval disarmament treaties which reduced the number of available capital ships, coupled with the long-term effects of the Great Depression on defense budgets and a prevailing anti-war sentiment amongst most Western democracies, meant that a lot of the upgrades and strengthening and defense and construction of Singapore were never truly carried out. But this didn't stop the Allies from using it as the crux of their Southwest Pacific defense strategy. Initially, the plan called for a British Pacific fleet to be stationed at Singapore comprising of battleships, battlecruisers, aircraft carriers, along with cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. As the Royal Navy lacked the resources to forward deploy a force of that size to the other side of the globe, the plan was altered to simply garrison Singapore sufficiently with air power and ground troops to hold the port facilities for an estimated 42 days until a British fleet could be assembled to steam from Scapa Flow, the home port of the Royal Navy, to relieve them. This was then extended to 70 days, then 90 days, and at the outbreak of the Second World War, it was now 180 days on the pretense that the fleet wasn't otherwise engaged. But as returning listeners to the podcast will know, at this time in the war, the Royal Navy was already embroiled in several major engagements. This included hunting for the Bismarck, escorting convoys to the Soviet Union, and fighting for control of the Mediterranean, each of which greatly impacted the availability of forces to be sent to Singapore. Furthermore, if the Mediterranean had been lost to the Allies, any fleet heading to Singapore would have to transit the Cape of Good Hope, further delaying their arrival. In October 1941, the decision was made that a force had to be sent to deter Japanese aggression in the South Pacific, following their invasion of French-controlled Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, the very thing that General Archibald Wavell in the Middle East was concerned about was actually a reality for Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commander of Malaya Command. This naval force was not going to be the 20 capital ships, 10 cruisers, 40 destroyers, and 36 submarines, which was the initial plan outlined in the Singapore Strategy. Instead, it was just the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable, and 4 destroyers. Conversely, in 1936, then opposition leader and future Australian Prime Minister Mr. John Curtin prophetically stated that Japan would likely only attack Singapore when Britain was occupied with war in Europe, which is exactly what they did. Now, the whole Singapore strategy hinged on 2 assumptions. The first was that the Royal Navy could come steaming in, guns blazing, to rescue the garrison if given enough notice, and that the US Navy could send its Pacific fleet, including 8 battleships, to Singapore if they were attacked. Now, that obviously requires the US Navy to not otherwise be engaged with their own conflict or have their entire battleship fleet crippled in a single surprise attack on a harbour in Hawaii. On the 4th of November 1941, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had the audacity to write to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to inform him that, quote, "With the intent of keeping Japan quiet, we are sending our latest battleship, Prince of Wales, which can catch and kill any Japanese ship in the Indian Ocean," unquote. The Royal Navy Force, now designated Force Z, entered Singapore Harbour on the 2nd of December, sans 1 aircraft carrier, which had actually run aground during its transit and would not be joining them, but not be supplemented by any other air power. By 1940, it was abundantly clear that the defence of Singapore and its quote-unquote strategically vital naval base depended on defending the whole peninsula, and the main way to do that would be air power, and that would mean between 300 and 500 modern aircraft to do so. Unfortunately, by the time that gunner Cleary arrived in Singapore, the Allied air forces had just over 250 aircraft, and most of these had largely already been considered obsolete by the start of the war. That, however, did not shift the operational centre of gravity away from the naval base, and even as Japanese troops were massing on the former French colonial territories, the focus was still defending the airfields and the naval base. Now, on the ground, Malaya benefited from excellent roads, including 2-lane highways constructed to facilitate the vital tin and rubber industries, with a number of switchbacks that could be defended. But due to the presence of a steep mountain range along the centre of the country, there were few connecting roads, which did hamper troop movements, which effectively meant that General Percival needed 2 essentially independent forces to hold the whole country. And while he did enjoy numerical superiority in ground troops, with over 130,000 British and Dominion troops under his command, to their detriment, most of these troops were largely inexperienced of fighting in the jungles. Overall, most of the men under his command were poorly led, undersupplied and poorly equipped, and underwent minimal training in the jungles they had to fight in and around. Now, this isn't to discount the brave actions of the individual soldiers in the upcoming defense. They were simply facing a much more experienced, motivated, and eager Japanese force. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese forces would land on Malaya, and while Prince of Wales and Repulse would put to sea to try and threaten the Japanese landing beaches, they'd be sunk within hours of engaging the enemy, sending shockwaves across the South Pacific, highlighting the strategic importance of air power. Now, I've already covered the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse back in Season 3. Gunner Cleary would be marched out of the General Base Depot on the 7th of January 1942, and the following day taken on strength with the 2nd 15th Field Regiment at Segamat in the state of Johor. 10 days later, the regiment would participate in Australia's first involvement in the Malayan Campaign, which would be the second and last Allied victory on the peninsula, the Battle of Gemmis. It was an ambush designed to delay the Japanese thrust southwards, localised around a wooden bridge at Gemachech, 7 miles west of Gemmis. The plan behind it was the brainchild of General Percival, who finally realised that he was going to continue to hold Singapore, that he needed to hold the Japanese at Johor to give enough time for fresh reinforcements to arrive. At Gemachech, on the eve of the ambush, the commander of the 2nd 30th Australian Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Blackjack Gallagher, told his commanders that, quote, "The reputation not only of the AIF in Malaya, but of Australia is in the hands of this unit," unquote. Just after 10 a.m. on the 14th of January, after allowing roughly 300 Japanese soldiers to pass towards Gemmis, the Japanese were on bicycles and gave the appearance of a picnic party than an advancing army, though they wouldn't have a chance to enjoy that journey as the bridge was blown, and the men of the 2nd and 30th opened up on the now stranded Japanese survivors with machine guns, rifles, and grenades. Captain Desmond Duffy, company commander of B Company, 2nd 30th, the officer in charge of the ambush, later recounted that, quote, "The entire 300 yards of road was thickly covered with dead and dying men, the result of a blast when the bridge was blown up and the deadly fire of our Bren guns, especially told to attend to the section on the far side of the bridge," unquote. While the 2nd 15th Field Regiment was in position to assist the ambush, the communication lines that connected them to Captain Duffy had been cut during the battle, which meant that while the Japanese were subjected to an artillery barrage, it actually came from their own guns, and the 2nd 15th, by all counts, had minimal involvement. Following the Battle of Gemmis and the subsequent engagement at Bakri, where members of Cleary's former unit, the 2nd 4th Anti-Tank Regiment, successfully destroyed 6 of the 8 Japanese tanks deployed in the advance, Colonel Gallagher ordered a general withdrawal to Segamat. Although estimates of Japanese casualties for the ambush vary widely, it is clearly understood that the impact of the Japanese forces was minimal, and the action did little to significantly slow their advance. Cleary and the rest of the regiment's gunners were in a near constant action, providing artillery support as the infantry withdrew along the Malayan Peninsula towards Singapore. By the end of the month, the last of the Allied troops had crossed the causeway into Singapore proper, and among the final units to make that crossing were the 2nd 15th Field Regiment's D and B troops, the last Allied artillery units in action on the peninsula. While the garrison held out as long as possible, the 85,000-strong Allied force, though still outnumbering the Japanese, faced an untenable situation. General Percival, acting under British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's orders to hold Singapore to quote-unquote the last man, was forced to confront the grim reality. The lack of potable water and the growing number of nearly 1 million civilians crammed into the remaining areas under Allied control made resistance increasingly unsustainable. Despite early declarations of defiance, Percival eventually agreed to Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita's demand for an unconditional surrender. On the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese, and the remaining men of the 2nd 15th Field Regiment, including Cleary, were captured. The following day, Cleary was reported missing. On the 29th of March 43, gunner Albert Niel Cleary was officially declared a prisoner of war, joining over 22,000 Australians who became prisoners of the Japanese during the Second World War. Initially, Cleary and his comrades were imprisoned at Selarang Barracks in Changi, the former British garrison on Singapore Island. Before being interred, they were marched to the most populous sections of the city, a deliberate act by the Japanese to assert their dominance and remind the local population who was now in charge. The Changi camp was maintained in part by Australian and British officers under Japanese oversight. Now, this was largely due to the sheer number of prisoners. Despite the harsh conditions, the prisoners themselves were responsible for much of their day-to-day administration throughout the war. Japanese contact with the prisoners was mostly limited to senior officers and work parties outside the camp, which did give the soldiers a distraction and the opportunity to earn money, which has apparently resulted in no shortage of volunteers for them. Despite the grim circumstances, the men of Changi worked to establish some semblance of normality. Extensive gardens were cultivated to supplement their meagre food rations, concert parties mounted regular performances to boost morale, and a reasonably well-equipped camp hospital was organised to care for the sick and wounded. However, from May 1942 onwards, the Japanese began transporting groups of prisoners across Asia and the Pacific to serve as forced labour on military projects, foreshadowing the future hardships that awaited many of these men. In July 42, Cleary and over 100 members of the 2nd 15th Field Regiment were transferred to Sandakan, Borneo, as part of the larger detachment known as B-Force, which comprised nearly 1,500 Australian prisoners to build an airfield. Now, if anyone asks, the correct pronunciation is Sandakan, though I will also accept Sandakan as well. On the 7th of July, they were transported from Changi aboard the Ubi Maru, one of the infamous hell ships. The prisoners had hoped they'd be boarding a hospital ship, but instead they found themselves crammed in the Ubi Maru, a 2,000-ton cargo vessel that seemed barely seaworthy. By all accounts, it struggled to even navigate Singapore harbour, let alone endure the open seas. To add to the situation, Ubi Maru had originally been an Australian cargo ship built for the wheat trade, but sold to Japan before the war. Its connection to the controversial pig iron trade, where ships sent to Japan were later broken down and used to manufacture munitions, is a bitter irony for the Australian prisoners now crammed into its hull. Conditions aboard the ship were abysmal. Men endured intense heat, cramped quarters, and meagre rations, with little chance for rest. Disease spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, and morale reached its lowest point. Yet, despite the brutal conditions, the determination of the prisoners remained strong, and after 10 long days at sea, Ubi Maru and its human cargo arrived at Sandakan Harbour on the 19th of July, 1942. After spending much of the day in the unbearable heat aboard the ship, Cleary and the other prisoners were finally disembarked and presented to Lieutenant Hosejima Susumi, the commandant of the No. 1 prisoner of war camp in British North Borneo. Following a cursory inspection and census, 2/3 of the prisoners were temporarily billeted in a nearby church. The remaining third was back aboard the Ubi Maru. The next morning, they were all marched 28 kilometres along steep winding roads to their new home. In contrast to the experience of Australian prisoners of war in Europe that I previously covered, which may now seem somewhat less severe in comparison, being a prisoner of the Japanese was an entirely different ordeal. While Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on prisoners of war, they never ratified it, and in practice, the Japanese treatment of POWs bore little resemblance to the protections outlined in that document. Their cultural attitudes at the time towards surrender, seeing it as a dishonorable act, meant that captured soldiers were treated with disdain and cruelty. Despite token gestures towards adhering to the international conventions, the reality was actually much harsher. The camp at Sandakan, built on the grounds of a former experimental camp, featured some well-constructed buildings, but due to the sheer number of prisoners meant to be working there, they were forced into overcrowded, hastily erected huts. Now, these were poorly built, leaked frequently in the island's heavy rains, and were stiflingly hot, making sleep nearly impossible. Despite their best efforts to make these accommodations more bearable, the prisoners often faced constant infestations of rats and bedbugs, which added to their misery. In August, when construction of the aerodrome began, the Japanese summoned the prisoners at gunpoint to assemble at a landmark known as the quote-unquote Big Tree. This towering remnant of an ancient rainforest that had once occupied the area loomed over the camp like a silent witness to the suffering below. Once assembled, the prisoners were addressed by Colonel Alfred Walsh, their commanding officer, who had been instructed by the Japanese to sign a declaration on behalf of all the prisoners. The declaration demanded their compliance with all regulations of the Imperial Japanese Army, a promise not to escape, and a grim warning that any escapees would be shot on sight. Walsh, who at the time had not been particularly well regarded by the prisoners under his command, stunned them all with an act of defiance that would resonate across the camp. Standing before them, he declared, quote, "The Japanese are demanding that I, on behalf of you all, sign this statement. I, for one, will not sign such a document," unquote. And without hesitation, he threw the paper at Hosejima's feet, an act of extraordinary courage given the circumstances. The consequences were immediate. Hosejima, fluent in English but insisted on using an interpreter, was incensed by the insult. He ordered Walsh's arrest, and the colonel was swiftly dragged away by guards. As the prisoners watched in horror, they turned to face the nearest guards, bracing for what was to come. Walsh was then tied to a nearby post, and Hosejima himself slapped him in the face. A firing squad was quickly assembled, and as their rifles leveled at Walsh, the sounds of rifle bolts being drawn back echoed through the air. It was a dire moment. Walsh's fellow officers, fearing that they were about to witness an execution, urgently pleaded with him to sign the declaration. Ultimately, it would be Walsh's second-in-command who intervened, initiating a tense negotiation with Hosejima. After a lengthy back and forth, a compromise was reached. Rather than Walsh signing on behalf of the entire camp, each individual prisoner would be required to sign the declaration themselves in order to save face in both parties. However, the men were then informed that anything signed under duress could not be legally binding, a small concession perhaps, but one that restored a degree of autonomy to the prisoners. When the signing began, the men responded in the true spirit of Australian defiance. Instead of providing their real names, many scrawled the signatures of famous Australian folk figures such as Ned Kelly and even former Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies. Some of the names were fictitious, others historical, but each signature was an act of rebellion, a small but significant reminder that, despite their dire circumstances, they would not surrender their dignity to the Japanese captors. The declaration might have been signed, but at the moment, the spirit of resistance remained unbroken. Now, being forced to construct the aerodrome, which despite claims was going to be for civilian use, a claim no one in the camp believed, actually violated the Geneva Convention, which prohibited prisoners from being used in military projects. But these rules were constantly being ignored by the Japanese anyway, so no one expected otherwise. Non-compliance would be met with brutal beatings, imprisonment, and even executions. The site that had been chosen by the Japanese officials had ironically been chosen by the RAF before the war for exactly the same reason, though they had only managed to clear some of the surrounding scrubland before it fell to the Japanese. While the officers were initially exempted from working on the airfield, one of the few provisions of the convention that the Japanese followed, they were allowed to establish a vegetable garden just outside the camp perimeter. This proved to be more than just a source of food. Through contacts with the local population still loyal to the British, the officers were able to create an underground intelligence network. This network involved people from all walks of life: doctors, police officers, factory workers, farm owners, and port officials, who covertly provided valuable information and supplies to the prisoners which lessened their ordeal. Now, despite the pervasive atmosphere of the camp, the prisoners made several bold attempts to escape. Just 12 days after arriving during a severe storm, 11 men tried to flee. While 5 of them managed to evade capture for 5 months, the remaining 6 were caught relatively quickly. Now, the island's Chinese population, fiercely loyal to the British due to the atrocities committed by the Japanese in mainland China, were willing to help the escapees. However, there was the Malayan and Indian populations, who, long subjected to discriminatory colonial policies, were more inclined to side with the Japanese and would routinely actively assist in rounding up escapees. From the outset, conditions at Sandakan were brutal and unforgiving. While the prisoners were provided a meager daily ration of rice, that was supplemented by the guard and supplies smuggled into the camp. Punishments for even the smallest infraction were swift and severe. Collective punishments, an alien concept to the Western prisoners, was enforced ruthlessly by their captors. Men were frequently confined to small cages for trivial offences and endured relentless beatings and starvation. Despite this, the prisoners found that the guards were largely leaving the prisoners to their own devices, as most of the Japanese guards were older veterans or soldiers recovering from injury, and the Australian prisoners became very adept at appearing busy while actually doing very little. Accounts of prisoners digging the same section of trench over multiple days, or wagons carrying debris or supplies accidentally, quote-unquote, falling over was a simple but effective protest against the actions of their captors. Despite these subtle acts of sabotage, timelines had to be maintained, and as the planned completion date of the aerodrome approached, officers and any able-bodied soldier, including medical personnel, were then pressed into working on the airfield, and in doing so, leaving unwell prisoners to their fate. And when the timelines weren't being met, even the unwell prisoners were forced to work. In December 1942, the construction of the aerodrome at Sandakan had been completed. Despite earlier assurances from the Japanese that the airfield was not going to be used for military purposes, a claim that no one believed, the first aircraft to land on the newly finished strip was a Japanese light bomber, carrying the newly appointed commander of all Japanese forces in Borneo. Yet, even in the face of such adversity, the morale of the Australian prisoners remained remarkably high. Shortly after the completion of the aerodrome, the prisoners participated in a sports carnival organised at the aerodrome. This event served as a powerful reminder of their collective resilience. For months they had endured grueling work in unbearable conditions, constructing an airfield that would serve their enemy, but they had refused to allow the Japanese to break their spirit. Remarkably, by the time the aerodrome had completed, only 14 prisoners had died in captivity. The Japanese, who had expected the relentless manual labour to sap the prisoners' strength and will to resist, were surprised by the Australian resilience. After working from dawn till dusk on the airfield, the men would return to camp and immediately engage in various forms of entertainment. Sing-alongs echoed throughout the barracks, games of chess and cards were played, boxing and wrestling matches took place and drew large crowds, even of Japanese guards. Various arts and crafts competitions and a thriving gambling scene developed, despite the latter being officially banned by the Japanese. 3 days' travel from Sandakan was the British POW camp at Jesselton, which housed British prisoners. Though the Jesselton POWs were not forced to work at the aerodrome like their Australian counterparts, they for some reason experienced a much higher casualty rate. This alarming difference in mortality prompted the investigation by the Japanese commandant of Borneo, which led to the eventual closure of the Jesselton camp. The surviving British prisoners were then marched to Sandakan, increasing the overall prison population. However, they were housed in a separate camp nearby, and the camp commandant, Hoshijima, sought to prevent any communication between the British and Australian prisoners, though that didn't stop them. Not long afterwards, another group of Australian prisoners known as E-Force arrived at Sandakan. Hoshijima, still intent on keeping all the different groups separate, ordered that all the prisoners of E-Force have their heads shaved and be issued with new prison numbers to distinguish them from the other POWs. In mid-July 1943, a significant shift occurred. The Japanese actually uncovered the underground intelligence network within the camp, linked to the broader Allied effort to monitor and sabotage Japanese operations in Borneo. This discovery triggered a brutal investigation by the Kempeitai, or the Japanese secret police, targeting the ringleaders and other suspected members of the intelligence ring. These individuals were either taken away for questioning or subjected to severe punishment, including confinement in cages, beatings, and starvation. Those in the cage were forbidden to wash or bathe, and their food rations were erratically alternated between normal portions and nothing more than salt and water. The fear of being implicated in the underground movement gripped the camp as prisoners waited for their turn to be interrogated. The Japanese guards also increased their vigilance, introducing nighttime patrols and using guard dogs to further isolate the prisoners. Nevertheless, the prisoners still found ways to communicate using hand signals, crumpled notes, and clandestine meetings, maintaining a fragile network of resistance. One of the survivors of the Sandakan camp, Private Keith Botterill, would later reflect on the drastic change that occurred in 43. According to him, the first 2 years in the camp were marked by relative stability, with plentiful food and few deaths. However, as the war dragged on, everything changed. The Japanese crackdown, the discovery of the intelligence ring, and the reduction in rations would set the stage for the camp's descent to even worse conditions. At the same time, the Allies had refocused their attention to Borneo. The British, eager to re-establish control of their far eastern territories, saw the island as critical to post-war recovery. Meanwhile, the United States Navy, in contact with Filipino guerrilla groups via submarine, realized that intelligence operations could be conducted as far north as Borneo. This resulted in Operation Python, a covert mission spearheaded by Z Special Unit of the Allied Intelligence Bureau. Their mission was to establish a wireless listening station at the Labuan Point in North Borneo and support local resistance efforts by providing arms and ammunition in exchange for intelligence on Japanese ship and plane movements. However, the Japanese swiftly uncovered attempts by Chinese and Filipino guerrillas to attempt to overthrow the occupation of Borneo. The Japanese responded with brutal repression, and by January 1944, the leaders of the insurrection were executed. The Kempe Ties investigation revealed connections between the Sandakan underground network and the broader Allied intelligence operation. Although they had no concrete evidence of a planned Allied invasion, the Kempe Ties suspected that the POWs at Sandakan might become involved in any future attempt to retake Borneo. This led them to cut back the prisoners' already meager rice ration, even though most of the prisoners were entirely unaware of what was going on, or the ongoing investigation, or the insurrection on the island. The camp situation deteriorated even further when General Yamawaki, commander of all Japanese forces in Borneo, ordered that an additional reduction in rations, fearing that American control of the sea lanes would soon disrupt rice shipments, a prediction that came true in July 1944. As the food supply dwindled, so did the prisoners' strength. Despite the severe malnutrition and deteriorating health amongst the camp's population, with dysentery, beriberi, and malaria running rampant, the Japanese still demanded the same level of work on the aerodrome with its expansion. The strain, compounded by intermittent water shortages and power disruptions, resulted in a rapid decline in health, with more and more prisoners succumbing to starvation, disease, and harsh conditions imposed by their captors. These dire circumstances would push some of the prisoners to consider escape as their only hope of survival, even as the Japanese tightened their grip on the camp. As the war progressed and the tide turned against the Japanese, the prisoners found that their rations rapidly dwindling and the beatings increasing. As a result, the health of the prisoners had deteriorated. This was compounded in August 1944 with the completion of the east-west strip that it actually finally drew the attention of Allied reconnaissance planes. This was followed by P-38 Lightning fighters strafing the airstrip, destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground, but also inadvertently attacking the prisoner war camp, killing a number of POWs. And while attempts have been made to identify themselves as Australians by painting POW signs on the camp or waving previously concealed flags to try and warn off the American planes, Christmas 1944 would see the airfield struck heavily by B-24 Liberator bombers, which knocked out the aerodrome. And while the Japanese continued to order the fittest prisoners to repair the damage, it would be a futile gesture as repeated daily raids, which meant that as soon as the craters were filled or buildings repaired, they would be once again destroyed. And with each raid, the Japanese became more and more ill-tempered. Though by January 1945, the damage dealt to the Sandakan airfield was so severe that it was determined on the 10th of January that it could not be repaired. And even if the Japanese forced the sick and injured prisoners to work on it, and as a result, the rice ration ceased. As this was happening, the Allies were encircling Borneo, with American troops preparing to retake the Philippines, and the strained 7th and 9th Divisions planning to eventually land on Borneo to retake Tarakan and Balikpapan on the east and Labuan in the west, though there was no initial plan to liberate the camp by the army, as its location was mostly a secret but to anyone outside of the Allied Intelligence Bureau. While there was a plan to land intelligence assets on Borneo to link up with surviving guerrilla forces to make contact with the camp and potentially rescue the prisoners. For the Allies, the planned landing at Borneo was collectively codenamed Operation Oboe, which was the second stage of Operation Montclair, which was the Allied plans to reoccupy the Dutch East Indies by taking and securing airfields that would support not only the liberation of what is now modern-day Indonesia, but also assist American forces in their liberation of the Philippines. It would commence with an attack on Tarakan, followed by landings against Balikpapan and finally North Borneo, and would actually constitute the last campaign Australian forces of the war. The Japanese, however, watching their empire collapse around them, could see the writing on the wall and knew that an invasion was imminent and tried to reinforce the island. And as a result, on the 27th of January, the Japanese garrison ordered 500 prisoners from the Sandakan camp to work on a new army camp in the location of the old British POW camp at Jesselton on the opposite side of the island, some 250 kilometers away. Unfortunately, when it came to the overland route march, the men who had been tasked with planning the route, who were actually anti-Japanese agents, and assuming that the route was only going to be used by the Japanese, mapped out the worst possible route for them, traversing swamps, thick rainforests that blocked out all sunlight, and multiple rivers and tributaries that would take 3 weeks, and would take 3 weeks with all supplies having to be carried overland by the prisoners and soldiers. The contingent would depart in groups of 50 prisoners, with an equal number of guards leaving a day apart. This coincided with the Japanese policy that now all remaining POWs were to be disposed of, and as the Allies were expected to land near the camp, the fewer prisoners that Hoshijima had to deal with, the better for him. Prior to the departure, the first contingent of prisoners were informed that they were going to be moved to a new camp with abundant food and shelter, and that the prisoners clamored to volunteer, either hoping that the Japanese knew that the war was going to be over soon and now wanted to hand over as many healthy prisoners to the Allies as possible, or seeing through the ruse, realizing that anywhere would be better than Sandakan. After loading up with rations from Sandakan and along with their few meager possessions, the first contingent departed the camp. They would meet a Japanese military contingent 9 miles away, standing next to a large mountain of Hessian sacks containing rations, ammunition, and other supplies, and the prisoners were forced to be loaded up like pack mules. Over the next 10 days, parties of 50 prisoners departed under guard, and the men had to travel over rough paths in heavy incessant rain as the monsoon season had started, which greatly affected the prisoners, most of whom were traveling barefoot and suffering from malnutrition, beriberi, malaria, and or dysentery. The march sapped whatever strength the men had left, which was compounded by the meager rations and poor shelter during the journey. Anyone who lagged behind or became too sick to continue was quote-unquote left behind at one of the rest houses. In reality, in following the Japanese standing orders at the time, any POW who had been left behind was disposed of. Only half the men on this first death march reached Renau, where they were put to work carrying rice to a Japanese food dump, and once they arrived at the camp, the death toll only managed to rise as the now exhausted prisoners were forced to work on the camp, where dysentery, beriberi, and malaria ran rampant through the survivors. Now this is where Neale Cleary rejoins the story, and in case you were wondering what Cleary was doing the past 2 years, unfortunately primary sources relating to the day-to-day of most of the prisoners at Sandakan are few and far between. As of the 2,434 Allied prisoners of war held captive there, only 6. Warrant Officer William Sipowicz, Bombardier Richard Braithwaite, Gunner Owen Campbell, Private Nelson Short, Private Keith Bottrell, and Lance Bombardier William Moxham survived. And what happened to Neale Cleary next is the only reason why he returns to the story. On the 3rd of March, Cleary and a mate, Gunner Wally Crease, had managed to escape from the camp, and a week later, fellow prisoner Keith Bottrell, on return to Renau following a burial detail, saw a prisoner, clad only in underwear, with his arms bound high behind his back and made to kneel with a log tied between his knees and near an empty area known as the guardhouse. It was Cleary. After being on the run for a week, he'd been recaptured by the locals for a reward. Already suffering from dysentery and acute enteritis, which had plagued the camp, Cleary would be tied to a tree outside the guardhouse by his neck and beaten with rifle butts, sticks, and anything else to hand. The beatings continued the next day, and when Crease was recaptured, he received the same treatment. The next morning, Crease was released to get a drink of water, and while the guards' attention was diverted, somehow managed to stumble away from the guardhouse. After shooting the would-be escapee, the guards vented their anger and frustration on Cleary using fists and rifles, then progressed to kick him whenever they passed and would urinate and spit on him. He would be forced every hour to stand with the sudden flow of blood to his lower extremities only serving to cause more pain. The only appropriate word for what the guards had subjected Cleary to was torture, as he was denied food or water. Prisoners who asked to tend to him were refused, and those who tried to help, talk to, or feed him were severely beaten. Covered in blood and bruises and dirtied by dysentery, he remained tied up for 11 or 12 days until the guards could see that he was dying. Finally, his brothers were allowed to tend to him. At a nearby creek, they washed away the accumulated grime and sludge from his wasted, battered body, before carrying him back to the hut where he died in their arms. He was 22 years old. According to the Japanese, his cause of death was beriberi and acute intestinitis whilst a prisoner of war. Australian records listed that he was murdered. Officially, Cleary would be declared by his captors as a criminal and thus not permitted to be buried with his fellow soldiers, but would be eventually interred at Renau No. 1 camp. His body was recovered and after the war was reburied at the Labuan War Cemetery. After Cleary died, the prisoners who witnessed what had happened to him made a vow that if any of them survived, that it had to be reported to Allied authorities. Keith Bottrell, one of the 6 survivors of the camp, testified in the 1945 War Crimes Tribunal at Rabaul that resulted in 3 of the guards of the camp being convicted of his murder. For Cleary's family, it would not be until 1988 they would find out what happened to him after watching a documentary about Borneo, when the camera panned over the Renau Memorial, which describes in vivid detail the last moments of Gunner Cleary. That memorial was erected on the spot where Cleary died and commemorates the Australian and British soldiers who died on the death marches from Sandakan to Renau, and those prisoners who died at Renau. After that discovery, Cleary's sisters attempted to uncover what happened to their brother. On the 4th of April 2001, Australian Labor Party Senator Chris Snatch, then Shadow Minister of Veteran Affairs, introduced the Award for Victoria Cross for Australia Bill 2001 to the Australian Senate. The bill sought to posthumously award the Victoria Cross, VC, to 3 servicemen, Private John Simpson Kirkpatrick, Gunner Albert Cleary, and Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheehan, for their actions during the First and Second World Wars. In June of that same year, Sid Sidebottom, the Australian Labor Party member for Braddon, introduced the Defence Act Amendment Victoria Cross Bill 2001, which reinforced the case for recognising the same 3 men. The push for the awards became part of the Australian Labor Party's platform for the 2001 general election, led by the Honourable Kim Beazley MP. However, the following Labor's defeat in that election, the proposed bills were not pursued further. In 2010, the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal received a submission asking to them to examine the eligibility of Australian personnel, particularly those who had served in the Second World War as Far East prisoners of war and were killed while attempting to escape or after being recaptured, to be recognised for some form of award. Initially, it was proposed that such individuals should be recognised with a mention in dispatches, or its contemporary equivalent, the Commendation for Gallantry, as Australia had already established its own honours system in 1975. In 2011, following the tribunal's inquiry, Gunner Albert Cleary was posthumously awarded the Commendation for Gallantry. While this inquiry was ongoing, another significant tribunal was also initiated. In 2011, Gunner Cleary was included in the quote-unquote unresolved recognition for past acts of naval and military gallantry and valour, known colloquially as the Valour Inquiry, which examined unresolved recognition for past acts of gallantry and valour within Australian military naval forces. This inquiry arose in response to a question raised in the Senate in 2010 about why no member of the Royal Australian Navy had been awarded the Victoria Cross. The inquiry examined the cases of 13 individuals, predominantly from the Navy, such as Captain Hector MacDonald Laws-Waller, Lieutenant Commander Henry Stoker, leading aircraftsman Noel Shipp, and Midshipman Robert Davies, who I've already covered. Cleary was one of the 2 Army personnel included in the inquiry, which were holdovers from the previous 2001 bills. Cleary was unique in that his inclusion came from the tribunal's original terms of reference, not from a family request or campaign. Furthermore, there was no historical record of Cleary ever being nominated for any formal award, so this wouldn't be a review, but a recommendation, and he was one of only 2 prisoners of war in that review, the other being Stoker. The tribunal received 16 submissions regarding Cleary's eligibility for the VC. Those in support of it emphasised Cleary's courage during his ordeal as a POW, the historical neglect of recognising the bravery of prisoners of the Japanese, and the symbolic importance of honouring Cleary as a representative of the 1,700 prisoners who perished in Borneo. These arguments highlighted that recognizing Cleary's bravery with the highest military honor would serve as a tribute to many of These arguments highlighted that recognizing Cleary's bravery with the highest military honor would serve as a tribute to the many others who had suffered and died in captivity. However, the majority of the submissions were against awarding Cleary the Victoria Cross. Respondents pointed out that while Cleary had indeed suffered brutal treatment, he was not executed outright, but rather died of the injuries inflicted upon him by the Japanese. Further, they noted the absence of any corroborating evidence to distinguish his case from many other Allied POWs, acknowledging the fact that only 6 survived the actual camps there. Additionally, Cleary had never been recommended for any gallantry award during his lifetime, and thus there was nothing to review. The primary difference in Cleary's case was that his treatment came to light only because a survivor lived to recount it, and his story only gained public attention at the unveiling of the Ronald Memorial at the site where Cleary had been held. Some submissions even went as far as criticizing the Prisoner of War Tribunal's earlier decision to grant Cleary a commendation of gallantry, suggesting that his actions, while brave, did not meet the criteria. The tribunal corroborated with the former tribunal in that they couldn't find no evidence of any effort to recommend Cleary for any awards, or that there was any inconsistencies in the British or Allied governments at the time when it came to awarding honours to POWs. The tribunal examined Cleary's case in accordance with the eligibility criteria of the Victoria Cross as it existed in 1945 for the Army, meaning that he would have required 3 witnesses to attest what had happened to him, that he conducted an act of the, quote, most conspicuous bravery or some daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy, unquote. They also reaffirmed that no person has, however, ever been awarded the VC for bravery while a prisoner of war, as actions conducted by servicemen in captivity are not to be considered quote-unquote in the presence of the enemy, in the sense of being in combat with that enemy. But the same basic requirements of performing acts of conspicuous gallantry in the face of the enemy are part of the eligibility requirements for the award of the Victoria Cross for Australia. On the other hand, since its institution in 1940, the George Cross had been the award considered appropriate to recognise the highest level of brave conduct while a prisoner of war or with dealing with prisoners of war, and has resulted in 3 Australians being awarded the George Cross. The current Australian equivalent to the George Cross is the Cross of Valour, which is the highest Australian Bravery Award. Now, the biggest difference for Cleary compared to the other submissions was that the tribunal was not reviewing a previously denied honour or award. They were actually being asked to provide a primary decision, of which they had received no new evidence to support such a claim under the eligibility stated in either 1945 or 2010, and that the tribunal found no evidence that suggested that during his period in captivity in Sandakan and Ronau, to suggest that he had carried out the actions that surpassed the expected conduct of any serviceman in captivity. Furthermore, they concluded that his treatment, while horrific, was not exceptional in comparison to that of other POWs. The tribunal determined that as it had not received any new evidence that could justify a recommendation for further recognition beyond the commendation of gallantry already awarded, and noting that the majority of submissions argued against Cleary getting the VC, as a result, the tribunal recommended that no further action be taken regarding Gunner Cleary's case for additional recognition. They, however, made the statement noting that Gunner Cleary's suffering and the inhuman treatment he received by the guards at the Ronau camp, that the Australian government continued to ensure that the memorial at Ronau was maintained in perpetuity. And there you have it, folks. That was the life, service, and legacy of Gunner Albert Niel Cleary. The harsh reality is that much of what we know about him today revolves around what was seen by Keith Bottrell at the Ronau camp, which regrettably overshadows the man he was and the life he may have lived. Gunner Cleary's story serves a poignant reminder of the suffering endured by the 1,700 other prisoners of the Sandakan Death March and the 8,031 Australians who died in captivity without anyone marking their passing. In remembering Gunner Cleary, let us honour their sacrifices and ensure that their stories, though perhaps shrouded in silence, are never forgotten. It is our duty to acknowledge the humanity behind the statistics and to reflect on the profound cost of war, both on the individuals and on families left behind, lest we forget. Works cited in this episode are the report into the inquiry and unresolved recognition of past acts of naval and military gallantry and valour, and the report into recognition of Far East prisoners of war who were killed by escaping by the Australian Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal, the written submission into the inquiry of unresolved recognition of past acts of naval and military gallantry and valour by Mrs. Lorna Wilson, the first reading speech of the Defence Acts Amendment Victoria Cross Bill 2001 by Sid Sidebottom MP, Gunner Cleary and the Ronau Death March Memorial by the Department of Veterans Affairs Anzac Portal and the Second World War Nominal Roll, the last post-ceremony of Gunner Albert Niel Cleary at the Australian War Memorial held on the 30th of May 2018, Gunner Albert Niel Cleary from the Find a Grave website, the service record of Gunner Albert Niel Cleary from the National Archives of Australia, the transcription of the War Crimes Tribunal of First Lieutenant Kitamura at the Australian War Memorial, our gallant POWs honoured at last by Samantha Maiden from the Daily Telegraph, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Trove, the online newspaper archive of the National Library of Australia, the Traces of War website, the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company, the unit diaries of the 2nd 4th Anti-Tank Regiment and the 2nd 15th Field Regiment, the official history of the Australian War 1939-45 Series 1 Army, and Sandakan, A Conspiracy of Silence by Lynette Silver. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History. This podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of each and every one of you, especially our Armoured Emu Brigade community. This episode was recorded in the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we pay our respects to the elders who have passed on knowledge for thousands of years. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Lauren Favell of My Silent Hero. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License, and all opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or positions of any entity, agency, or organization. If you like what we do here and want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is share it with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Trust me, I read all the reviews and your feedback truly helps others find the show. You can also support us on Patreon, where your contributions will help keeping the podcast running. Plus, don't forget to check out our merch store for the Armoured Emu Brigade unit patches. They're perfect for any fan. To join in on the conversation, come chat with us on Discord. For more content, including photos, show notes, and transcripts, head over to the website at thedocnetwork.net and follow the show at IWODMJ on all social media. I'm at Doc Winters. Once again, friends, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye. Australia's military history told through the stories of those who served. This has been a Doc Network production.